We'll now take a look at a range of Intel processors, starting with some very early socket-based processors such as the 486, the early Pentium and Pentium MMX CPUs, and a more up-to-date Intel 4 CPU, and some slot-based processors as well, the Pentium 2 and the Pentium 3. This is the Intel 486 SX CPU. It has no built-in math code processor, so if we required math code processing in our system, we would have had to install an Intel 487 SX CPU. This model has a clock speed of 33 MHz. It has 8 kilobytes of level 1 cache built into the chip. It has 32-bit memory addressing, so it can access 4 GB of physical RAM, and fits into an Intel Socket 1. To make sure that we can fit the CPU correctly into the socket, we have a marking in this bottom corner which shows us where pin 1 is on the CPU. If we look at the underside of the chip, we can see it has a PGA layout, pin grid array, and again we can see where pin 1 is on the CPU, just down here. Here's a couple of early Intel Pentium CPUs. We have an Intel Pentium and next to it a Pentium MMX. The Pentium MMX has extra microcode instructions built into it, the multimedia extensions. The Intel Pentium has 120 MHz internal clock speed, achieved by running from a 60 MHz frontside bus multiplied by 2. It has 16K of internal level 1 cache and can access 4 GB of physical RAM, and fits into either a socket 5 or a socket 7. Down here we can see the pin 1 marking. The MMX here has 166 MHz clock speed internal, achieved by running from a 66 MHz frontside bus multiplied by 2.5. It has 32K of level 1 cache, can access 4 GB of physical RAM, and fits into a socket 7. If we look at the underside of these chips, we can see they both have an SPGA, a staggered pin grid array format. This is a Pentium 2 processor. As you can see, it's very different from the Pentium and Pentium MMX that we just saw. The Pentium 2 comes in a package which fits into a slot on the motherboard. If we look at the bottom edge, we can see some edge connectors, much like we get on a sound card or a network card, and that's what pushes down into the slot 1 on the Pentium 2 motherboard. Notice the notch, which makes sure we get the processor the correct way round. This package includes a heatsink and a fan. This model, Pentium 2, has a 450 MHz internal clock speed, achieved from a 100 MHz frontside bus multiplied by 4.5. It has 32K of level 1 cache and 512K of level 2 cache. It can access 4 GB of physical RAM and, as mentioned, fits into a slot 1. This is a Pentium 3 processor. You can see, like the Pentium 2 we just saw, it's in a package, a single edge cartridge. This Pentium 3 has a 733 MHz internal clock speed, achieved from a 133 MHz frontside bus multiplied by 5.5. It has 32K of level 1 cache, 256K of level 2 cache. It can access 4 GB of physical RAM and, like the Pentium 2, fits into a slot 1. We can actually take this Pentium 3 apart a little bit. Just slide this clamp off. We can now detach the processor package from the heatsink, and because this is an old processor we no longer need, we can break apart the processor card from the rest of the packaging. Now we can actually see on this side the CPU itself. On the opposite side is our level 2 cache memory, and we can more clearly see the edge contact which fits into the slot 1 on the motherboard. And lastly, here's the Pentium 4 processor. We've put it next to a Pentium 1 so you can more clearly appreciate the size difference. You can see the pin 1 marking in this bottom corner to help us orient the CPU the correct way around in its socket. This Pentium 4 is a 400 MHz model achieved by multiplying a front side bus of 100 MHz by 4. It has 16K of level 1 cache, 512K of level 2 cache built into the chip, and can access 4 GB of physical RAM. And it fits into a socket 478. Look at the underside of the chip. We can see it has a pin grid array format. And we can clearly see again in this corner the pin 1 marking. After inserting this Pentium 4 into its socket, we would have to apply some thermal paste or a thermal heat pad to the CPU, and then attach the heatsink and fan.